Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tom Landy. Welcome to Ream Library and the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture. This afternoon's lecture is part of a key initiative of the McFarland Center, which we're calling Catholics and Cultures, which aims to build understanding of how Catholicism is lived and practiced in countries and cultures around the world. You'll learn more about our programs and find recordings and lectures online at holycross.edu/McFarland Center. This will be one of those lectures online in a few days. Anya Peterson Royce, who's with us, has spent more than 4 decades studying the Isthmus Zapotec, a people in southern Mexico whose identity intricately blends their indigenous spirit with the larger Catholic Mexican culture. Today she'll talk about journeys of transformation, Isthmus Zapotec, beliefs and practices surrounding death. Anya Royce is Chancellor's Professor of Anthropology and Comparative Literature in Indiana University. She also serves as adjunct professor in the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology, the Russian and East European Institute, the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. A former professional ballet dancer, Professor Royce's fieldwork among the Zapotec grew from an interest in anthropology of dance and the performing arts. In 2010, she received the Outstanding Faculty Award from the statewide Indiana Council for Continuing Education for a course that she taught on modern dance. In 2011, she was awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Limerick, which acknowledged her contributions to the preservation and understanding of indigenous culture through nurturing and reimagining music, arts, and dance. She's author of books including The Anthropology of Dance, Ethnic Identity, Strategies of Diversity, The Anthropology of the Performing Arts, Chronicling Cultures, Long-Term Field Research in Anthropology, and her most recent book, the topic of today's talk, is Becoming an Ancestor, the Isthmus Zapotec and the Way of Death. Please welcome Anya Peterson Royce.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. It's my first time to Holy Cross, to this part of Massachusetts, and it's beautiful, and I'm glad that there's not... How many feet of snow did you have 2 weeks ago? Yeah. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. After I talked with Professor Landy, I kind of added pilgrimage and healing because I really want to talk about journeys of transformation, and death is one of those, but pilgrimage and healing are also two. And I want to start by reading a very short description of a Palm Sunday in 1977 when I was in the city of Juchitan, Oaxaca. And I had just come back from the chapel in the cemetery where my Zapotec family are buried. And we went there early in the morning to clean the tomb and to leave the flowers and things like that. So Palm Sunday, 1997, the sky is electric blue, cloudless on this early morning. I was in the courtyard of San Vicente Ferrer, the parish church, just having returned from the cemetery where I helped the family arrange the armloads of flowers necessary for this day of remembrance. I was waiting for the arrival of the Palm Sunday procession, which was then winding its way through the streets after distributing palms to all the participants at the small chapel in the cemetery. And I could hear them as I was standing in the courtyard. Voices raised in those songs welcoming Christ the King to Jerusalem, and the higher-pitched voices of children rising above with cries of Vivo Cristo Rey. The church behind me is filled with flowers, white gladiolas, many dozens of them, jasmine and frangipani, scattered at the feet of all the saints in the church. And the fragrance was overpowering with the heat of the fat beeswax candles. Everything is ready, and the crowd was dancing with anticipation, and a scout returned from the corner saying, "They're just turning the corner." And then, as if I'm not hearing correctly, I hear the long, low notes of a funeral song. Jesus Urbieta, one of the cadre of talented young painters who died in Mexico City just 2 days earlier, is being borne by silent comrades to rest a moment in the Casa de la Cultura where his paintings had often hung. This is the parish church of the city where I work. And this is the House of Culture, or the Casa de la Cultura. And they're right next to each other. And the only thing that divides the two of them is a wrought iron fence. So you can see between the courtyard of the church and the courtyard of the House of Culture. So Urbieta is being born in his coffin to rest in the House of Culture for a moment. And meanwhile, the Palm Sunday procession is coming to leave all of the palms and the flowers in the parish church. And the two processions arrive at exactly the same time. With the image of Christ, San Salvador, the Christ riding into Jerusalem on the donkey, is borne on the shoulders of men who care for him, with heavy garlands of frangipani hanging down. Let me go back so you can see this one. This is the image of San Salvador as he is borne into the Palm Sunday procession into the church. And this is the frangipani, and this is what he looks like in the church. Everybody in the Palm Sunday procession is ecstatic. They're excited. They're happy. They're shouting. They're singing songs. And in the meanwhile, the funeral procession is coming into the same thing. Also, Urbieta, in his coffin, is being carried in on the shoulders of the men who were his friends when he was alive. And his coffin is covered with the same flowers, white flowers and things like that. And so it struck me as these two processions came together at the same time that Urbieta had begun his journey to his new home among the dead, and Christ, in the midst of celebration, had begun his death a week later. So the Isthmus Zapotec, I'm going to go back. I'm going to get this right at some point. The Isthmus Zapotec, is there anyone here who travels in Mexico, who knows Mexico? Yes. Okay. All right. This is the southern part. It's a 12-hour bus ride if you're in Mexico City, down here to the very low point, sea level, very hot, very humid part of Mexico, and it's right on the Pacific Ocean, so you can sort of see where this is located. The Isthmus Zapotec people, who make up about 70% of the population of the city where I work, which is now maybe 90,000 people, are a rarity within Mexico. They've survived 2,500 years of attempts to exterminate them in the beginning, to bring them into submission, to assimilate them, to reach a place where they can and do name themselves and claim their place. And like all peoples who persist through these kinds of shifts and changes in the larger political and economic context, the Zapotec have maintained certain fundamental values, and we'll be talking about those tonight, along with outward markers of who they are, at the same time that they exploit opportunities, technological, economic, political, that give them a competitive edge in the global arenas. So, for example, my 93-year-old Zapotec mother sits every Saturday at her kitchen table with my cousin's laptop open, and she's talking via Skype with her grandson, who lives in Japan. So it's kind of an interesting blend of these kinds of things. They live in a city of about 90,000 people, and it's on the Trans-Isthmian Highway and the Pan-American Highway across there, and there's a railroad that runs through. There's a Walmart that opened up 3 years ago, and it was soon joined by another big box stores. So they have all of these markers of global identity, but they maintain a unique indigenous identity. And some of the things that characterize that and that have brought them to the attention of journalists and filmmakers and tourists include complementary and equal roles for women and men, an active political sensibility that often brings them head to head with the state or the national level, a vibrant artistic community of musicians and composers and painters, writers and poets, a huge array of very large fiestas known as velas, and the active use of the Isthmus Zapotec language in both its written and spoken forms. In fact, they're publishing more in Isthmus Zapotec now than they were 4 decades ago when I first went there to work. Beliefs about death incorporate some of the very important qualities of Isthmus Zapotec that they've maintained throughout their history. Those include the qualities of balance, of transformation, and community. And I think when you look at those together, they represent a pull towards symmetry, economy, and rightness. And they're equally necessary for the dead as well as for the living. Ideally, the passage from life to death is accomplished in an unhurried manner, accompanied by the fragrant greenness of flowers, by the rising clouds of incense, and the soft cadences of prayers rising in unison. Women and men work together, each with a set of tasks to make the death of their loved one good. Ebet Rasgado, a good friend of mine and a wonderful musician who unfortunately died about 3 years ago, said to me, "Death is to be savored and remembered in colors, aromas, sounds, and textures." And the word for, there's no word in Zapotec for death and no word for life. The two words that we would translate that way mean dying and living. So Gendaguti is dying and living is Gendanabani. So it implies a process and not this fixed point between life and death. And this is really important when we begin to talk about death as a journey and death as transformations. When you look at death and how the Zapotec celebrated and helped their loved ones along this journey, you see a coherent set of acts and beliefs and attitudes that, while they don't erase the pain of loss, allows both the living and the dead to work, and there's another term in Zapotec for that, in a measured, balanced, harmonious way that not only satisfies the actions that are called for whenever someone dies, but it also satisfies the Zapotec sense of beauty and doing something well. There is one very important value that the Zapotec have maintained for a very long time, and it's this one, Gendalisa, and there's this word, this prefix in the front of it that is the one that's in front of death and life, right? And it's an activating. It turns whatever it's connected to into an active thing. So this literally means, you can gloss it as community or kinship, but it really means creating kinship through fiesta, through kin ties, and through all of these kinds of things. So it means that you have to work hard at it to make it happen. This notion of community, I think, is what allows the Zapotec to step out into the strange, into the unfamiliar. It allows my Zapotec mother to sit down and look at Skype, or it allows people to go to Walmart at the same time that they're doing other things that are thousands and thousands of years old. Because anybody who wants to step out into the unfamiliar has to have the comfort of knowing that there's a community behind them, so that if they step out and they fail, there's a body of people who are there to say, you're okay, we'll do it, we'll try it again. And that's what this means, this Gendalisa, creating community. It's embodied in action, in fiestas, in all of the celebrations about death, in pilgrimages, and in healing. So these are actually cousins of mine at a large fiesta of the family. So you have kind of nuclear extended families, and then this kinship extends out to the whole community. Okay. The Zapotec have another two words for One that sort of means the familiar, the thing that you know, and the other means the wild, that thing out there that you don't know about. So Giji on the one hand and Gishi on the other hand. And the familiar means usually the pueblo, the town, your family, the people. And the Gishi is the wild places outside. So the notion that in order to advance, to change, to grow, you have to leave what's familiar and go to this unfamiliar place. And you're supported by the community and by experts. And we'll talk a little bit about who those experts are that can help you make these kinds of transformations. Okay? Gendalisa, this notion of community, again embodies a whole number of things. So the Vela parades, these are huge fiestas, and there's a parade that goes along with them, a mass in the church, an all-night dance, and a daytime dance. So these are some of the floats that you would see in one of those parades. It also applies to, this is my family on their ready to go to the 7-year Mass for the dead, for the father of the family. These are sort of the two, this is the river that runs around the western border of the city and the southern border of the city, and it kind of marks off, this is the city over here, and this is the wild over here. So there's a kind of a physical marker there that you can see. This would be wild place, okay, so that you don't have to go too far, but you have to go out of what is comfortable for you. There's states of being and places in the environment, okay, states of being for people and places in the environment that range between qualities of wetness and dryness, and these are really important notions for a lot of the indigenous people in Mexico, but particularly for the Zapotec. Most of the time, the Zapotec look for that balance point, not too wet, not too dry. But in times of transformation like death or illness or pilgrimage, they need the life-supporting qualities of wetness. Okay? So again, if you think of death as this ongoing process, and you're moving this person from the community of the living to the community of the dead, you want them to remain as wet as possible for as long as possible. So there are lots of plants, which include flowers, trees, and herbs, that are categorized by the quality of being wet, naya. Flowers of the wild, that is, those unfamiliar places, have wet qualities. They're very fragrant, and they're regarded as being able to protect and to heal. Okay, so that these are frangipani, and this is on a pilgrimage. A young man is carrying a cross of one of the pilgrimages, and you can see this is even at the beginning of the pilgrimage, and the cross is hung with these frangipani, which are very fragrant and very, they have this quality of wetness to them. And so they are protecting, they're kind of a protection and a healing possibility. This is the image of the Dolorosa, the Mary, as she appears on Good Friday, but also on the last Friday in Lent. And so you can see she too is hung with these frangipani, which are kind of offering protection, healing. And when people come into the church, they will touch the flowers, and if they're flowers that are left here at the like these that are at the bottom, they may take those home for a family member who might be sick or needs something like that. So it's a very active use of these flowers. This is a tomb in one of the cemeteries, and these flowers of the wild are laid out in the shape of what to us looks like a cross. But if you're speaking Zapotec, it translates as flower body. Okay, and it's one of those things that that when someone dies and the body is taken off to the cemetery, you lay out one of these flower bodies in front of the home altar, so that the spirit has a place to rest. So these are made up of flowers of the wild that are fragrant and wet, and also sand and layers of sand and herbs and flowers of the wild. This happens to be a tomb that has some of these healing herbs growing in it. So people are taking care to make this a place where the spirit and the soul finds a home. Mary is described in Zapotec as Shunashi, which means sweet smelling virgin. And the devil is described as Binijaba, which means a stinking person. So you've got the Binijaba. Yeah. So you have that contrast even there. That goodness, protection, healing, transformation is associated with sweet smells, and the opposite is has to do with things that don't smell so good. So you'll find lots of jasmines, frangipani, tuberose, palm flowers, the inside of the palm. I'll show you one of those in a minute. Very sweet smelling kinds of flowers. And they have, it's kind of an extraordinary taxonomy of flowers. First of all, you have flowers of the wild, and then you have flowers of the town. Flowers of the town are the cut flowers that come in, get trucked in, and they include chrysanthemums and carnations and things like that. And you use them for other kinds of things. But flowers of the wild are what you use for healing and for death and for pilgrimage. But beyond that, there are flowers that are called scattering flowers. So that you would put them, these would be scattering flowers. And then there are flowers that are called simple flowers that you might throw over the head of saints or over the head of the young man who goes as Christ in one of the stations of the cross. So, again, all of these images have direct connection to water. So that when they describe the way the flowers are thrown over the heads, it's the same verb that's used for a soft rain. There are probably 7 flower markets in the city, and they're all kind of, they're specialists. Okay, so that you go to 1 or 2 or 3 of them if you want flowers of the wild and if you want healing herbs. So this is one of the markets where you would get, this is basil, which is used in healing. It's regarded as a very powerful kind of herb. The idea that you would eat it is totally foreign. I mean, these are flowers that are already made up for scattering, and these are some frangipani here. And then there are asters in case you want to have flowers in vases. These are the tuberose, and tuberose are really interesting because they're very fragrant flowers, and they used to be used at home altars and in tombs. They've been replaced by white gladiolas, which have the advantage of lasting longer, costing less, and they're kind of more spectacular when you look at them. The disadvantage is that they have no fragrance. Okay, so you still find tuberose in the market, and then these are flowers in the market for scattering. This is the palm sheath that has an inside fragrant flowers, and these are those gladiolas that you would find in the market. And this is what the inside of that palm flower looks like when you open it up. It's very sticky, it's very wet, and it's extremely fragrant. And so this is one of the processions in the city, and the men are carrying the koyol, and they give pieces of it to people who are lining the parade route. And then at the end of the parade, all of what's left of the koyol is heaped on a cross in the church courtyard. So again, it's using those flowers as healing kinds of images. The flowers come from the wild and come from the town. There are also places that have transforming qualities. So mountains, rivers, especially rivers that run and then disappear because they go underground and then they come back up again. Caves, lagoons, the sea, and you know from the map that Juchitan has all of these kinds of things in the area, and this notion of these transforming places goes back before the Spanish arrive on the scene. These are places that you don't usually run into in your daily lives, but they're significant points for pilgrimages, and we'll see that. Death and dying are journeys during which both the dead and the living community are transformed, taken away from the familiar, what they know, and ultimately restored, although changed, to a place of comfort. Okay, so that when someone dies, it leaves this hole in the community. And the whole process, which takes 40 days, we can talk about why 40 days. Anyway, it takes a long time, is a process of moving the person who's died to this other place, but it's also a process of restoring the community around the absence of that person. So when someone dies, it marks the beginning of that journey. They're laid first on the floor in front of the home altar, and every home has at least one altar, which is maintained with photographs of people who have died. So they're laid on the floor, which reconnects them to the earth from which they came, in that particular place of Juchitan. Then they get transferred to a cot and then to a coffin. The body is surrounded by 4 huge beeswax candles and large vases of white flowers. The more fragrant the flower, the better. The farthest point from the altar, going toward the door, is marked by flowers of the wild and by incense, which are both fragrant. Okay. After a period when family and friends come to pay their respects, but never more than 24 hours, this is a part of the world where the average temperature is 88 degrees. It goes up to 115 degrees, and they don't do autopsies and they don't embalm. We can talk about why that might be, too. So 24 hours is the longest time that a body would stay in the house. The coffin is closed and it's taken in procession to the cemetery. But there's a group of women who stay in the altar room and they work as quickly as they can, building this flower body out of healing flowers, fragrant flowers, sand, watering down each layer. And the term actually for sprinkling the water on the layers is the same term that you would use if you were asperging saints or relics. So we can talk about that too. Basically what this flower body does is to make a home for the spirit, or the soul, if you want to call it that, because the body, physical body, has been taken to the cemetery, but the spirit and the soul stays in the home for 40 days. So from what people tell me, it's a very frightening thing for the soul to be separated from the body, and so it needs this kind of home, which is very wet, very fragrant, very comforting for it. And the 40 days mean that it gives the spirit enough time to be strong enough to rejoin the body. Dying is a process of drying out, and so what you want to do is to surround the body with wetness and flowers and sand and water and healing herbs. And the important point is to make this a slow process, and we've talked a little bit about what's going to happen to me. because they want me down there. But I can't imagine getting myself down there in one piece. And cremation, as you might imagine, is not something that they are comfortable with, because it's an immediate, instant drying out. There's no journey, there's no process to take it. So we haven't figured that out yet. But it has engendered some interesting conversations about it. The flower body is refreshed every one of the first 9 days, and there are prayers every afternoon and evening, and these are regular Roman Catholic prayers. A prayer leader comes in, and the women of the family sit and pray. And then at the end of the 9 days, all of those flowers are gathered up and taken to the chapel of the cemetery where the person is buried. Okay, so that the body gets the benefit of those flowers. And for the remainder of the 40 days, then there's some substitute bodies, if you want to call it that. The flower body is gone. There's a long row of flowers of the wild from the altar out, and it's anchored at one end, the far end, by incense. So that goes on for another 10 days. And then those flowers are then represented by a photograph of the person on the home altar. So you can never have more than one body at a time, because it's very confusing for the spirit or for the soul. They don't know where to go. At the end of the 40 days, there are 2 rounds of prayers where everybody comes back. And then they put small palm crosses in the windows of the doors and windows of the home to sort of gently tell the spirit that it needs to be in the cemetery now. It needs to be reunited with the body. And while it can come back on certain days, it really doesn't belong in this house anymore. So at the same time all of this is going on, they're doing the same thing in the cemetery with the body. So it's being surrounded by wetness and by flowers and those kinds of things. There are 2 community-wide celebrations that have to do with death. One of them is the Day of the Dead. These are interesting because they divide the year into 2 halves. So Day of the Dead at the end of October, beginning of November, is the beginning of the dry season, which is called in Zapotec Gusiba, which means season of the tombs. It's a season where it's characterized by 40 to 50 mile an hour winds blowing through the city. For them it's cold. It's probably 70. And people don't go out very much. There are no fiestas, there are no weddings, there are even no healing, public healing services during this period, this half of the year. So the Day of the Dead ushers that in. Holy Week at the other end begins the season of the flowers, Gusigie, the season of flowers, which is when everybody has fiestas and people are out in the streets, there are parades, people can get married and people can be healed and things like that. So it's interesting that those 2 halves of the year are marked by these 2 really important acknowledgments and celebrations of death. Day of the Dead in Juchitan is not like Day of the Dead in other parts of Mexico. It's celebrated in the home. And part of this is because the Zapotec are very, if you believe in this kind of community and actively making community, then invitations are really an important part of what you do. So on the Day of the Dead, the living invite the spirits of their dead ancestors back to their homes. during Holy Week, the visits go to the cemetery where the dead invite the living to visit them, right? Because you never, if you accept an invitation, it obliges you to return that invitation. So the Day of the Dead in Juchitan is celebrated in the home, and these are some of the altars that you, first of all, you need to be sure that the spirits get back to the right place. So the way you call them is by flowers of the wild, flowers and greenery of the wild, and in particular by marigolds. In Mexico, they're the flower of the dead, flower of death. And there was a form of marigold before this came about. So you frame the house entryway with, this happens to be palm fronds and banana leaves, and then you frame it with marigolds, and you hang things like green coconuts, which are also wet and that kind of thing. And then if you look inside, you can see that if the spirit finds its way to this house on the street and comes in, that it's led through the house to the room with the altar, again by greenery and flowers that lead it. These are two kinds of altars. This is called Shandu in Zapotec, which probably comes from santo, which would be a Spanish word for saint or altar. Okay, and it's a kind of a 7-tiered affair, but it divides actually flowers into the flowers of the wet flowers here. Fragrant flowers are on a mat. So the important thing is that the spirit comes back and doesn't wander around the house. So you want to keep the spirit within these confines so that it's defined on the floor, it's defined on the sides, and it's defined in the back. So that once the spirit gets there, that's where it stays. So they're called green coconuts on this mat, and amaranth and palm flowers. And then you can see the photographs of the people who have died. So the recent dead would be prominently in the center. This one is an older form of an altar, and it's called Biguier, spirit flower. That's what it means. Okay, B is the Zapotec word for breath, for wind, for the original God was called B, which is kind of universal, right? Okay, so this is a Biguier, and this one really does have 4 sides, a top and a bottom. The only thing it's missing is the front door. But it's a safe space for the spirit to come and to be there for the days of the prayers for Day of the Dead. And this one's got a baya laid out on the mat in the front, and then it's got greenery and green flowers, and the whole top is a canopy of banana leaves and palm leaves and willow branches and those things that are all fragrant and wet. And here's some more examples. The city, if you're anywhere within 10 blocks of the downtown part of the city, you can smell marigolds by the time from the 10 blocks away, because they just truck in enormous quantities of marigolds. The couple of Days of the Dead when I was down there, and I went with my sister, we went to 21 altars in 3 days. I mean, that was kind of standard. Okay, and you take marigolds to each house that you go to. These are coconuts and banana branches and leaves in another part of the market. This would be a decoration that you would put on the inner courtyard door to call the dead. And this is the shandu of my family when my Zapotec father died. So you can see the kind of decorative bread that you would find. You put things that the person liked in real life, and I learned by doing it wrong that you have to unwrap everything. So if you put a bottle of beer on the altar, it has to have the top off. And if you have a tamale, it has to be unwrapped with a fork, because how are they going to eat it otherwise, right? No hands. Okay. So that's the last big community-wide celebration until the Christmas posadas, which are kind of small affairs compared to other kinds of things. When Lent comes, everything gets canceled for those days of Lent, except for the daily walking of the Stations of the Cross, which starts in an outlying chapel, and they walk through the streets, hitting 13 stations until they get to the parish church. Okay. So it's every Friday in Lent. The 13 families along the way volunteer to have a station in front of their house where people stop, and then you have people who volunteer to be part of the procession. And there are two things going on in that procession. One is the liturgy are the standard reading of the Stations of the Cross, although they read them in Zapotec as well as Spanish. But what is being enacted is this battle between Christ, the young man who goes as Christ, and the centurion. And they confront each other in these at each of these stations. Okay, and the what protects Christ, and this, I don't know that I have a better image of that, but this is the young man who is walking the stations as Christ, and he carries the cross in front of him, and the cross is hung with frangipani, flowers, and 3 times the centurion approaches Christ with his sword, and he's repelled by the flowers. And the 3rd time, his face is in the flowers, and he kisses the cross, and then he goes back. So it's a very powerful, visible kind of image of the power of these crosses. And these are some images, a small Station of the Cross, but again, you can see the cross is there and frangipani around it. And this is my family's cross with, again, frangipani everywhere. And so the procession will stop at each one of these crosses along its way. As Christ walks this station, his way is made sweet by having these simple flowers thrown over him and at his feet. The centurion doesn't get any. It's really kind of okay. All right, so that's the sort of Stations of the Cross, which do bring in these kind of two kinds of elements. When it starts at the outlying chapel, there are not very many people. There might be 40 people. By the time it gets to the parish church, there are probably 400 people who've joined it along the way. So and it's a powerful thing to be part of and to watch. Kids run around all the time, and they're very noisy. When the stations are being walked in their neighborhood, there's total silence. Dogs don't bark. Kids don't yell. So it's kind of a powerful thing. Holy Week has 2 different kinds of things that are going on. One are the visits to the cemeteries, and the other is the Holy Week liturgy. Both of those are made to conform to Zapotec notions of what needs to be done. Holy Week maps onto some pre-Columbian spring planting and rebirth rituals. We don't have a lot of detailed descriptions of what those might have included, but they do include, from what we know, acknowledgement of the ancestors, okay? Telling them what was happening, asking their advice, asking their blessing and their intercession. And this is still actually what happens now. The ancestors remain very close to the living in pre-Columbian times. The household compound was around a household altar, and people were buried in the compound, so that you didn't have to go very far to acknowledge your ancestors. Even today, when you have some important rite of passage that's going to go on, like a couple are getting married, one of the ritual speakers will go with the bride and groom to the house of the bride, and the first thing he does is to go to the home altar, and he speaks to the ancestors in the altar, saying, your granddaughter is going to get married, and this is what's happening, and we want your blessing on it. So there's a really powerful sense of involving people who have died in these kinds of things. Conversations with the ancestors take place in the cemeteries. Remember, they've invited the living to come. So people do. Palm Sunday is for one of the cemeteries in the city. There are 3 now. So you visit the ancestors, you decorate the tombs, you buy food and drink. So it's kind of like a huge carnival. And the interesting thing is, all the politicians who are running for office come to these things because they meet everybody, right? And there are certain foods that are sold. These are sweets. But there's also a chocolate drink that goes back to maybe 900 BC that's made with unsweetened chocolate and thin corn gruel, and it's flavored with frangipani flowers. Still, so it's kind of nice. So when you visit those tombs, the conversation takes place between people who are visiting, but also people who are visiting and the people who are buried there. It's a very important part of keeping them in touch. This is another one of the chapels and cemeteries. You can see it here. It sort of was dropping out of use, but people would still come on Holy Monday, and you would see this whole cemetery lit up with candles and with flowers and people visiting. And then the municipality bulldozed the whole thing down 2 years ago. And actually, my photograph is the only one of the chapel the way it was. So this is the cemetery of Holy Wednesday. It's on the other side of the river. And this is a woman who's decorating a recent tomb, and you can see that she's using the palm flowers as a base, and then herbs, and then she's got jasmine in there, and she's got a whole bucket of scattering flowers and frangipani on the cross. So recent tombs are usually earth floors, and always have flowers of the wild because the soul needs the wetness. And this is another kind of thing. And then this is that particular cemetery with people coming and going. This is the same cemetery, and this was a tomb that had burned down, but the people in it were recently dead, and so this is on the Holy Wednesday when you visit the tombs, and they've made a real effort to make these beautiful. And then this is a very recent tomb of one of the important writers in Juchitan, and people, not just his family, but people will come and leave frangipani and things like that for him. So outside the cemeteries, it's like a carnival where people are selling food, selling beer, selling all kinds of soft drinks, selling balloons. They have these big things now where the trampoline things inside a cage, so the kids can play on the trampolines. So so it's a time for parties as well, okay? And these are vendors at that particular cemetery. And you've got musicians who you can hire, who are there, traditional musicians in the kind of flute and drum musicians and then a band, and then mariachis have come in too. So you hear, if you're celebrating somebody who died a long time ago, you want a mariachi band to play lively things. And if a person has died recently, then you want the other kind of music. So you hear all of these kinds of things. At the same time, all of this other stuff is going on in the church for the Holy Week liturgy. But it starts on the last Friday in Lent, and it's like musical saints for the whole of Holy Week. I mean, they're brought out of their normal niches and put in front of the altar on certain days, and then they're taken back, and another saint is brought out. So the last Friday in Lent is the sorrowful, La Dolorosa, is brought out, and also San Salvador from Palm Sunday. Okay, and they each have their society that's in charge of taking care of them, and but many people come in and out of the church all the time, and they will bring their own flowers and leave them, and then they will take flowers that have been hanging for a while on the saint because they have more power. This is Holy Monday, and you get San Salvador is still there. This is and you also have Jesus, who's going to be the main character on Good Friday. Okay, so he's already out there on Holy Monday. Tuesday of Holy Week, the Santo Entierro, Christ in his coffin, is brought out, and there's a really important mass, Roman Catholic Mass, which is relatively short. The priest leaves, and then the Zapotec come and do a cycle of prayers, and they have musicians who come in, and they bring armloads of flowers for the Christ. No one had an answer for why this is on Holy Tuesday, and he's in his coffin, except that it's a different society that has to do with this saint. So that's probably why. But that was a very interesting thing. Holy Wednesday, she's the patron saint of Oaxaca, La Soledad. And so she also doubles as Mary Magdalene. I know. On Holy Wednesday, when you get the same figure that we saw before, it was in white, now in black, sort of kind of leading up to. And Holy Thursday, maybe for me, was the most interesting, in the sense that of the mixture of Zapotec and Roman Catholic, because the liturgy was Roman Catholic liturgy. Except that you have these 12 men who are sort of representing the apostles, which is okay. But they're sitting in chairs that are woven with willow branches, representing wetness. And in between the two rows of men, there's a flower body laid out, just as if it were in a cemetery or if it were in front of a home altar. And it's oriented so that the head is close to the altar, which is what's used for unmarried people who die. Okay. So it's as if the Christ has died, and this is part of his mourning on Holy Thursday. Okay, so in a very real sense, the crucifixion and death of Christ is like the death of somebody in your family, and you treat it in the same kind of way. Later on, during the Last Supper, which is outside in the church courtyard, all of the food and the flowers are flowers of the wild, and the water that's served has frangipani blossoms in it. So, again, it's that kind of blending of elements. And then on Good Friday, we get a whole parade of images coming back again. The Dolorosa, San Juan, the Christ, and Soledad, who are all out early in the morning of Good Friday in the church. And then there's a noon procession. Christ and Mary and San Juan leave the church one after the other. They take different routes. They come together. They meet in front of the chapel called Calvario. And then they come back to the main church together. Okay, and you can see that they're hung with frangipani. This is Christ and Mary meeting here. This is Mary coming out of the church, and you can see these flowers that have been thrown over her. All the society for Mary are women. Okay, and then this is San Juan who comes at the end. It's a very powerful kind of transforming kind of procession that happens. And then back in the church is the pageant of the crucifixion, where Mary Magdalene is important. Christ is put back in a coffin, and he's carried through the streets. The centurion brings up the rear to an outlying chapel where he stays. People bring flowers and candles all through Friday night and through Saturday morning. And that's kind of the end of Holy Week. Ends with the crucifixion. Okay. So these are all kinds of examples of transformations, changing, that are accompanied by rituals and by certain kinds of language and certain kinds of flowers and herbs and things like that. Okay, pilgrimages are another huge kind of transformation. I walked this one 2 years ago, and probably it's one of the most moving experiences I've had in 4 decades of working in this place. It's a 15-mile walk from the edge of the city through the wild to an outlying chapel that sits at the base of a hill and across a river. So it's located in one of these magical places of healing. And I walked it with my Zapotec sister, and I walked it for my Zapotec mother. Before I left, I said, I'm walking this for you. At the same time, I was trying to document it. I took 400 photographs, and I was making notes and being the ethnographer, I thought. And then when somebody said to me about mile 12, you could just go, off to the highway and get a taxi and go to the chapel. That's okay. And I said, I'm walking this for my mother. And then she said, oh, okay, then you have to walk it. And when I said that, I realized that this was really an emotional kind of thing for me, and that it meant something more than documenting this kind of pilgrimage. The people who are walking the pilgrimage take this big cross, which sits in the house of the sponsors during the year, most of the year, and then they take it on this procession, 15 miles through the wild, to the outlying chapel. And this is sort of one image of that procession with this cross. And this is in November, but it was broiling hot. This is the probably the person who knows most about what's going on. The cross, both the pilgrims, those of us who are walking it, and the cross are fed at each one of these stops. So you get given tamales and something to drink and a shady place to sit down and rest. And the cross is given flowers and incense and a shady place and some prayers. So it's the kind of creating community that is really important. Helping people make this transformation that happens when you're walking this kind of pilgrimage. Help the cross make that kind of transformation and help people. This is beginning in the House of the Mayordomos in the 5th section, so that there are not too many people there yet. Welcoming along the way. This was last year's sponsors, close to the end of it. And this is, have to say, was very hard to be this kind of detached observer at this point. There's a small bridge, a causeway bridge across the river, and the two crosses that stay in the chapel during the year are brought out of the chapel by a small group of men, while the big cross that's being brought out to meet, because they get lonely for each other, and they meet on this bridge, which is over the water. And then they all three go back to the chapel, where they stay together for several days before the big cross is brought back into the thing. But this was a extraordinarily moving moment for everybody who was involved in this kind of thing. That these crosses that haven't seen each other meet in this kind of magical place. And this is the end point. This is the hill, and this is the river now. So you can sort of see at the end of the procession, people stay all night, and early the next morning they climb this hill and they leave offerings of flowers of the wild and candles, and they ask for intercession from two kinds of people, from the Catholic saints, from the Holy Cross, and from the spirits of the mountain and the water. All right. There are 3 more pilgrimages in the city, and the only point I want to make is that this is the river that goes around the city, dividing it into the subtle places inside and then the beginning of the wild over here. And the 3 that still have these pilgrimages are located here and here. So there are already people who are sort of in that transitional place between the settled and the wild. And this is what it looks like on the outskirts of that particular section. And that's what the wild looks like. Yeah, if I hadn't been there with 500 other people, I would have been afraid. I mean, it kind of felt a little strange. The last little, I want to just make reference to this, has to do with healing, which is, again, going into the unknown and bringing back knowledge. And healers do this all the time. They go out to dangerous places and they find ways to heal people and they bring it back. This is the healer with whom I worked for a long time. He died about 6 years ago. He was the most senior of the healers, and you can see he's got a Calvin Klein t-shirt on. So he was a kind of an extraordinary guy. This is his temple. 2 versions of it. This is where he would kind of channel spirits of the dead. If people wanted to talk to ancestors, he would do that. And this is where he would conduct his healing. And these are some of the healing plants that he would have been using. This is the altar that marked the first anniversary of his death. I was not there when he died, but I was there the following year, and I went to the house to be part of the observation of his death. One of the things that you do when you're a healer, normally you get very ill, and have a very high fever, and then you have a vision. When you come out of the vision, you talk about it, and if people believe it, they apprentice you to a healer, and you work for about 10 years learning all of the plants and how to diagnose and things like that. Then they send you off to some foreign place. And in his case, he went to Guatemala to learn how, and what he said to me was, I had to go away from what I knew in order to learn strange things, in order to come back and understand what I knew. So, and he would diagnose and go into trance, and then he would come back out of the trance, and then he would talk to you about and he would always talk about going places in that trance state. anyway, because he always was looking at new and different kinds of things, I would bring him things like Tibetan prayer beads, or an Apache owl shaman headdress, or a rosary. Well, he had rosaries, actually. Had lots of rosaries. But I would bring him sandalwood bracelets and plains smudge sticks and things like that. And then we would talk about, what did these traditions mean? And when I went back there for the anniversary of his death, all of those things were on his altar. I mean, he had the Tibetan beads hung around the Virgin, and the photograph of him on the altar was the one that I took of him. These are some of those healing plants, and these are frangipani as they live, water lilies and dill and basil. And I'm going to end by talking about just Faley. He was a man of great wisdom and faith. He was a man who was fearless of change or the unknown. He was also a man of great wit and curiosity. He loved ice-cold Cokes, even though he was diabetic. And he was a man who always seemed to know when I would be coming to see him. Even on my first visit to his tomb, when we walked out to the cemetery with his niece, where I was about, 2 rows over from his tomb, and I heard this voice saying, "I knew you would come." So he embodied, I think, what all Isthmus Zapotec cherish, those journeys and transformations and the courage and the community that they require and the promise that they extend. Not many live or die into them as fully as Faley did, but each knows them from time to time in body and heart, enough to find the courage and to share it with each other. Thank you.